All right, my friends, today we are going to talk about clauses and phrases. And I don't mean Santa and his wife. We are talking about chunks of words that make up sentences. Let's dive into it. Now, a clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. And if you think back to a video that we saw a couple weeks ago, you should remember that in order to have a complete sentence, you need a subject, verb, and a complete thought. So a clause is almost that complete sentence, but not quite, because it isn't necessarily a complete thought. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a second because there are different types of clauses. But for right now, just think about a clause as almost being a sentence. Now, a phrase, on the other hand, is a group of words without a subject and a verb. So it's just a chunk of words. You can see on the chart on the left that our smallest increment that we're working with is words, and then we get up to phrases, and then clauses are a little bit bigger than that, and then sentences, and then paragraphs. So if we're talking about Santa Claus being a clause, then phrases might be his little elves running around. Now, there are two types of clauses. There's a Mr. and a Mrs., right? The independent clauses are those clauses that actually do contain a complete thought and can be sentences on their own. So they have the subject, they have the verb, they have the complete thought. They are fine to just act as their own sentence. An independent clause is a sentence. Now, dependent clauses, on the other hand, are an incomplete thought. So they have the subject and the verb, but they don't make sense by themselves. They need a little bit extra in order to be a sentence. Now, the reason why this is important is because clauses and phrases impact where we place commas in sentences. Now, we're going to go through three main patterns that we see a lot in the English language. These aren't the only patterns for sentences, so I don't want you to think that this covers all of them, but these are the three top ones, and they're going to be important to show you how to build sentences with clauses. Let's look at the first one. All right, in this pattern, we have a dependent clause plus a comma plus an independent clause. Now, if we think back, a dependent clause is not a complete sentence by itself, but an independent clause is. So what we have is a partial sentence plus a comma plus what could be a sentence. Let's look at the example. Although I was hungry, comma, I decided not to eat breakfast. So in the first half of that sentence, we have although I was hungry. I as our subject, was as our verb, but we can't just say although I was hungry by itself. That doesn't make sense. If someone just came up to you on the street and said although I was hungry and walked away, you would have no idea what they were talking about, right? So that is a dependent clause. But on the other half of that comma, we have I decided not to eat breakfast. Now that is an independent clause because we have our subject, which is I, we have our verb, which is decided, and it is a complete thought. We could just say that by itself and it makes sense. So our first pattern here is dependent clause plus comma plus independent clause. Now on the ACT, they are going to test you for this. They want to see if you can correctly place a comma in this pattern. They want to see if you can tell where the dependent clause ends and the independent clause begins. So it's helpful when you read sentences to try to chunk them out into those clauses. Try to get into that habit. Let's look at another pattern. Here we have an independent clause plus a coordinating conjunction plus a dependent clause. Notice there isn't a comma here. So if we put the dependent clause at the end of the independent clause, most of the time we aren't going to need a comma. We're going to put a coordinating conjunction there instead. Now, for those of you who don't know coordinating conjunctions, remember fanboys. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Those are our only coordinating conjunctions. Let's look at our example. I was hungry. That's a complete thought. It has a subject and a verb, so it's an independent clause. But, there's our coordinating conjunction, decided to skip breakfast. That is not a complete thought right there. So we have independent plus coordinating conjunction plus dependent clause. Let's move on to the next one. Independent clause plus comma plus coordinating conjunction plus independent clause. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about run-on sentences in the future. However, know for now that a lot of run-on sentences happen when we don't correctly combine independent clauses. So you'll see here that we have two complete sentences. I was hungry and I decided to skip breakfast. We are joining them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. If you don't have both of those parts, it's incorrect. And we'll go over that in more detail later. But for now, remember our three main parts. I'm going to go back here. First one, dependent clause plus comma plus independent clause. Next one, independent clause plus coordinating conjunction plus dependent clause. Finally, independent clause plus comma plus coordinating conjunction plus independent clause. Now, one last thing to mention. On the ACT, they are going to test you on this first one, like I already mentioned, but they are also going to test you on introductory phrases. So if you remember the first part of this video, a phrase is a little bit smaller than a clause. It's not quite a clause, but it might be something like, yesterday after school, comma, you need a comma there. Whenever you have a timestamp, throw a comma after that. It might be something like, I would, but, and you go on from there. So our phrases can be diverse. They can be a lot of things, but the easy way to find them is to first off look at the beginning of the sentence and see, is it kind of an introduction to a bigger sentence? Or is it part of the big sentence? So in this example, for instance, our main sentence is really, I decided not to eat breakfast. What comes before that is simply an explanation leading into our main sentence. So when you're reading, try to chunk those out. Try to see, where does the main meat of the sentence begin? If there's something before that, double check it. You might need a comma. If you have questions, let me know.